Okay, we're going live now. Good to go.
Hello, First Teams, and welcome to the first Fundraising Toolkit, Section 1.2 webinar, which is focused on the topic of creating a team business plan. My name is Joy Becker, and I'm the first Fundraising Toolkit coordinator, and joining me for this webinar is FRC Team 3132, Thunder Down Under.
Hello.
The first Fundraising Toolkit was created using a Argosy Foundation. The focus of the grant provides teams with materials to fundraise, helps them develop local sponsor relationships, highlights successful fundraising methods, and also increases the sustainability of first teams in their local areas. The goal of Section 1.2 is to help students understand the various pieces of a business plan and encourage teams to create a business plan and utilize it appropriately to help better their team and make them more sustainable. So, today I have James and Mike here from the team, and they're going to talk a little bit about what we'll be going through in this webinar and then do a little introduction to their team, who is a 2012 Championship Entrepreneurship Award winning team.
Go ahead, James.
All right, so I'll start by doing a bit of an introduction to our team. So we are first team 3132, the Thunder Down Under. We started back in 2010 as the first FRC team in Australia. And since then been working with a whole lot of sponsors and partners to make first quite large in Australia. We've now got, I think, 18 FRC teams, a whole bunch of FTC teams, about 22 now.
Actually,
and
42.
42, sorry, and over 200 FLL teams. So from 2010 up into 2013, we've made big changes, and that's been partly because of our business planning for the future. So without further ado, we'll get into what today's topic is going to be, and that's about how you design a business plan.
Yeah, so since we won the Entrepreneurship Award at the 2012 Championship, a lot of teams have contacted us, and when they contact us, they ask us for our business plan, and we ask them, why you want our business plan? They said, because they want to have a good template for writing a business plan, and we pretty much at that point tell them to stop, because a business plan isn't a template that you fill in, and it's not a fill-in-the-blank sort of exercise. And I think a lot of teams fall into that trap that they do a business plan just because they think they have to do a business plan. And so it's important to understand and take a step back and ask the question, well, why do businesses have something called a plan, or why do businesses do a business plan? I've been in business for a long time. I started 2 companies. I've probably done half a dozen formal business plans for different reasons, so it's fair to say that I have a little bit of experience in this area. And but normally people fall into the trap of doing a business plan because they think they need to do a business plan as the sort of the end unto itself, when really they want to do a business plan as a means or a process for getting to something.
Yeah, you've definitely got to ask yourself the question about why do you want a business plan, and what is this going to provide for your team in the future?
So if you just go back to that original slide. So one of the things that's important to understand is that a business plan really is a headline or a header for, we're going to start a process, and the output or the document is going to be the output of that process. But we really want to start with a question that we want to answer. There's a problem that we want to solve, and we need to put together a plan for how we're going to solve it. And in most cases, when you want to do a business plan, you don't even know what the question is to start with. You may have a notion of what the question is or what the questions are, but you really need to sit down and focus and understand that question as the focal point for what you're going to do for the business plan, or else you're just going to come up with a piece of paper that really isn't going to help your team do anything other than satisfy the requirement to have a piece of paper.
Yeah, it's really important to identify a need for your business plan. So instead of just making one, you go, okay, it can serve a purpose for our team. It can help us achieve certain goals. And so you can see on the slide here that we've got a few examples of what obstacles teams might face and why you design a business plan to come around those. So we've got things like funding for your team there, getting sponsors, new students or mentors, and also rejuvenating a team. If they're quite an old team and they're starting to slow down a bit, you might design a new business plan to be able to adapt for challenges you might face in the future, to bring in new money, to bring in more students or mentors, or just help yourself get a few new sponsors and things like that.
Yeah, and the analogy in the business world is because you hear a lot of businesses have to have a business plan. The reason why they do that typically is because they're trying to get funding. So they're going to go to the bank and ask for a loan, and the bank is going to want to see enough information about the team that they understand the question, if you will, of why we need more money and how we're going to use it and how we're going to pay it back. The bank wants to see that. Or if a company is going to go public on the stock market, the stockholders are going to want to see what the company is going to do with that money. So the reason why a lot of businesses have plans is because they have to answer this question of what are you going to do with this money when we give it to you. That doesn't mean that your business plan as an FRC team has to address what you're going to do with money should a sponsor give it to you. Your question is going to be unique. Your question is going to be different depending upon where your team is in the course of its history and what challenges your team is currently facing.
Yeah, so when you're putting together your business plan, you want to ask yourself a few questions. You want to think about, when I'm putting this together, what benefit is this business plan going to provide me, and how am I going to overcome these barriers? So up on the slide again, you can see that there's a few basic questions you should definitely ask yourself before you go into actually constructing your business. So you've got to think about what your biggest challenges are. What's stopping you from achieving what you want to do? And then what's your biggest opportunity? How can you leverage things that are around you, whether it's your sponsors, your partners, your mentors, your students? You've got to think about what those opportunities are going to be and how you're going to use them to extend yourself in the future. And also what your biggest strengths are. What have you got behind you? What know-how and things have you got to excel you for in the making of your business plan? And
there's a lot of different tools in the business community that somebody would learn if they did an MBA or if they went to business school or just they've got a lot of background in running successful businesses. There's a lot of standard business tools that people use to do these sorts of things. So we're not just throwing you in the deep end and telling you to figure out what your biggest problem is or to answer these questions. There's actually a formal business tool called a SWOT analysis, which stands for strength, weakness, opportunity, and threat, that allows you to identify these things and talk about them. And then from that, figure out sort of what sort of environment you're operating in, where are your challenges, where are your strengths, what resources you could bring to bear. But also through the course of doing this, sometimes your biggest challenges or the things you need to work on surface out of the SWOT analysis. For example, if you really struggle to put 2 or 3 bullets in any one of these areas, then that should raise a warning flag that you really need to work on that part of your team. So if you struggle with understanding what your threats are, and that might be something that you haven't really thought about. But as an FRC team, what are the half a dozen things that would cause your team to fold up and disappear? Those would be the threats. A lot of teams don't think about what their threats are because they just are in the moment, or they look back on their history and see that everything's really good. But if you do this exercise and you understand what your threats are, then that'll tell you what sort of things you may need to work on to sort of buttress your team or to provide a strong foundation so that they don't happen. So you're anticipating sort of what environment your team is. And sometimes we talk about if so-and-so got hit by a bus, what would we do? Because they have some special knowledge. And that's a really scary thought. Well, if you want your team to be sustainable, you need to go to that scary place and think about those things. And the SWOT analysis is one way to do that, not only for the threat, but for the strengths, the weakness, and the opportunities.
Yeah, I think, because teams are submitting for an award here when you're making a business plan, teams might be inclined to kind of leave the threats and weaknesses side a bit less, filled out than some of the strengths and opportunities, because teams might think, well, it's not good to have, weaknesses and threats in our business plan because it shows first that, we're not as strong as we could possibly be. Well, that's not necessarily true in the sense that when you're making a business plan, it's about identifying what you guys need to work on and where you guys can move forward. And by not filling in those threats and weaknesses, you're kind of giving yourself that kind of false idea that you guys are invincible and that you can come out and you can attack anything however you want. It's really important to identify those strengths and weaknesses, opportunities, and threats as much, it's important to identify your weaknesses as much as it is words.
Your strengths and your good points.
Yeah, exactly. It's important to identify your weaknesses as well as your strengths. Those are really important
The other thing to remember is that the people that you're presenting to for these award submissions, they're professionals, and they live in the real world, and they know that if you give them a very one-dimensional portrait of your team, that there's nothing wrong. Our team is wonderful. Everything operates perfectly into plan. We have no threats. We have no weaknesses. They're going to know that that's not a very realistic view and that you haven't done your homework in terms of putting together a plan. And in fact, you're not. It portrays you as not a strong team, even though you're telling them that you have nothing but strengths. A realistic picture is a much stronger team. The second point that comes out of what James said is that oftentimes the most powerful things that you can work on, the most powerful things that you could bring to the first community, to bring to your community, come out of your weaknesses. Because if you can identify things that you're weak at, those are things that you should put resources and time into, and that's going to really further your team and again, give it that strong foundation. But those things often pay amazing dividends.
Yeah, they do. So I guess next would be to talk about how you might go about constructing a business plan.
And Renee, you can jump in here anytime.
Oh, yeah,
We're on the show.
If you get a chance to actually say something.
Yeah.
One quick question. With the SWOT analysis, could you talk a little bit about what the difference is between a strength and a weakness versus an opportunity and a threat? A lot of times when I work with teams and we start making a SWOT analysis, it's hard for the students to understand the differences in the two areas, strength and weakness versus opportunity and threat.
Okay, well, I'd see, and I may be wrong in this, but I'm fairly confident that when you're talking about strengths, it's things that you actually have, right? Things that you can definitely say, this is something that we definitely have, this is something we can put to the table and we can prove that we have. But it's opportunities are things that we go, there's something in that in the future, and there's an opportunity to build upon that and actually add that to your strengths. It's the same with weaknesses, right? Weaknesses are things that you currently have and things that you currently face. Whereas threats are things that you can say in the future, this is probably going to be an issue, and we need to identify that and move on from that and avoid that in the future.
Yeah, the easier way to think about it, what James said is absolutely right, but the reason why we put the SWOT analysis in this format is basically the things in the two top boxes are internal things. They're things that we own and things that we have on board already. The things in the bottom box are external things and things that affect us from the outside that we don't have as much control over, if any control over. And similarly, the things on the left-hand side, the strengths and the opportunities, we want to look at positive aspects, and things on the right-hand side we want to look at as negative aspects. So that's the reason why this is put into a quadrant like that. That's a great question.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Let's continue.
Okay. So SWOT analysis is one process that we use in the course of developing the business plan. And in one sense, it helps us focus on the question or distill out what the question should be, or questions. From the SWOT analysis, we could see what resources we have in terms of strengths, what things we might want to do in terms of opportunities, and what threats and weaknesses we really should work on. But once we do that, then we need to have a plan. We need to go from that question to how we're going to tackle that question and turn it into a solution. And one of the most powerful things that I've found in the course of my career is when you bring a group of people together is brainstorming sessions, but to do it in a structured way rather than just sitting around the table and putting ideas on a piece of paper or a whiteboard. So what we do here at Thunder Down Under is we use a divergent, convergent thinking or problem-solving process where we start with a question or questions and we just sit down and start generating some really crazy ideas sometimes. And the idea is that no idea is too crazy, no idea is too off the wall. And then once we literally fill up a whiteboard or whiteboards, or you put paper around the room with all the ideas, then you've got to apply some rationality to it so that you can get from all those really good ideas down to an actual way you're going to solve the problem.
Because the main thing, you might have these brilliant ideas, but again, when it comes to constraints, you also need to consider this is a business plan, and there is a way that you need to construct it so that it is presentable information that people can read and understand, so that it's not just a whole bunch of ideas and things that we've done, and then we got money from this person, and then you're talking about something else, and they got money from this other person, and it's all come together, and now we've got $200,000. That's great, but it does need to be structured in the right way, and needs to be put together. And in that convergent thinking process, you go, okay, this is great, but it might not be overly relevant. We're going to put this in instead and talk about that.
Yeah, oftentimes for us, the constraints will come in when we want to do something stylistically. So if we if we decide, for example, that after we go through a SWOT analysis, that we want the emphasis of the team, for example, to focus on problems with the team members, that we could help individuals realize more of their own potential, that becomes a constraint on our divergent thinking for that process. The solution has to focus on individuals. Or the constraint may be, well, we want to work more with external organizations. So the constraint for all our wild and crazy ideas are, how do we pull in some of the charities that we work with, or how do we pull in our sponsors, or how do we pull in people who have a lot of resources in the sense of connections in the community. Those things become constraints for what our business plan is actually going to do, but they're not part of the solution necessarily. They're just a way to narrow down or frame the solution.
Yeah.
So,
I agree.
yeah, I mean, we were just doing this last night. We were starting to think about what our chairman's video should look like for next year. And so we had all the things that we've done for the year up on the whiteboard, but the constraint that we applied was, stylistically, the people on our media sub-team had some ideas about what they'd like to do artistically with the video. And so that became our constraint for how to narrow down all the wild and crazy ideas that we had. But at the end of the day, what happens after we go through this whole process is not only do we have a plan that came from our question and all our wild idea generation, but we have a consensus among all the members who spent the time working on it, because it was a team effort. It wasn't one idea, it wasn't one person. It was a whole process that we went through as a team, and everybody's welcome, whether you're the person who paints the bumpers or the person who writes the chairman's essay. Everybody is welcome to be involved. But we went through this process as a team, and so the whole team actually owns the question, the process, and the plan, and it's something that we can rally around as a team.
And it's really useful for team members to understand how business plans put together and what you've got in your business plan, so they understand what you've done, why we've done some of these things, and financially it's also important because people might have a slightly more realistic perspective of how much money a team can actually spend on something. I want a CNC mill. Well, that's a few $100,000. You can't just chuck that. You've got to have those constraints, and then the team's got to understand that. So that's quite important.
Yeah.
And this model, I mean, it sounds very similar to the way that teams go through the process of determining what their constraints are for their robot every season as well.
It's funny that you should mention that, because we actually stole this or borrowed it from the process that we use to develop our robot every year. And that actually came out of, to give credit where credit is due, Mo, in the eastern part of the United States, Team Mo, I think it's 365, developed this collaborative design process that they gave to the first community. I think it was in 2007 or 2008. I've been mentoring first teams since about then, and every year I've used this process or a derivative of it. And when we came here to Australia, one of the things that's great about what Mo did was that it develops this process, but and articulates it and allows teams to very easily execute it given the set of slides that Mo developed. But one of the problems with it is that it assumes that there's already a first culture going on. And it assumes that you're designing the next year's robot after having designed many years worth of robots, and that everybody in the process knows what that means. And so what we had to do here in Australia, because we had no first culture, was we had to adapt it, and we had to put in the underlying assumption, or build throughout the process the underlying assumption of what it means to be in first. What are some of the first principles, like gracious professionalism? What does it mean to get a kit of parts and have to operate within a kit of parts and to operate within a ship date? And all those things that sometimes first teams take for granted, we had to put back into our process, our collaborative design process. So we didn't want to take anything away from Mo, but we had to redefine the process. So we now call it osmosis for Australian Mo-based system design, and we found it very, very helpful in designing our robot. But then we realized that the very same process, just like you said, Renee, the very same process that we use to build the team up, have buy-in and consensus for designing a robot, that is at the end of the day, or at a very high level, it's exactly the same thing you want to do with a business plan. You start with a question, and you have some constraints. Yeah, the challenge. Here's 200 pages of rules and a 3-minute animation. Okay, the question is, what robot do we build? And then you have to do all this wild and crazy thinking, and then you got to converge down to a robot design. Well, once you have your question on your business plan, the very same process is applicable to developing a business plan instead of a robot.
Yeah, exactly. It's checking out all the ideas that you have and putting that all together so people can see these are ideas we have. Maybe we can combine some of these ideas, and that's really useful because sometimes one person might have an idea and the other person has another idea, and if you combine those, it can be really powerful tools. So it's always important to have as many ideas as you can out.
Yeah.
Do you ever focus, in terms of this model, on being able to set goals for specific sub-teams and having them kind of, determine what they want to do, lay it all out, and then come back together for a plan?
Well, I think the interesting thing that's happened is we've created a culture here now where the collaborative problem solving and divergent and convergent thinking is a natural part of the way the team operates. So once a sub-team is given a problem, I don't think they formally go through this. They don't pull out the osmosis slides and say, okay, we got to do a collaborative design problem or collaborative problem solving exercise. I think it's just the way we do things now. And the first thing that people do is they get up at the whiteboard. They say, okay, what are the crazy ideas do we have? And you see people just doing it automatically because it's part of who we are as a team now, because we've emphasized this process not only in our business plan, but also in our robot design year after year.
Yeah, we'll let you in on a secret tip, and that is if you've got all of these ideas up and you don't shut any ideas down from the beginning and you get absolutely everything from the craziest to the most conservative ideas, put them up on the board, there's probably a really easy way to combine some of those crazy ideas and the conservative ideas to make something that's really original, that's something really innovative, and something that can make a huge impact on the first community or even the world. So it's always important to get as many ideas as you can up there and never shut any of them down until you start thinking about those constraints, because there's no bad ideas.
Yeah, and to build on James's idea, I hadn't thought about this, but it just came to my mind. When you get all those crazy ideas up, it's not a bad idea to look at them and try to find a unifying theme around the ideas that you think are really valuable. And oftentimes, your constraint will come out of that, or you'll have, again, it'll be a theme that ties everything together in a really unique way that you wouldn't have thought of because you didn't have all those crazy and conservative ideas combined up there at one time.
Yeah, it's all about, and that, I got so many ideas still bubbling to the top. All right, so let's start with that one. It's important that you got to realize that you can apply this to every aspect of what a first team does, right? It is incredibly useful for a business plan. But just like last night at our team meeting, we were using this exact same method for chairman's planning. We use that exact same method when we're thinking about, for example, the Dean's homework submission, the rock automation, engineering our future competition. We use that exact same process of sitting down and going, these are all our crazy ideas. How can we either make them happen or going, okay, that one's a bit too crazy, let's go for a slightly more conservative one and make that happen. And so we all understand, everyone on the team understands that process.
When I work with teams, I sit them down through a process of doing a brainstorming session around their outreach opportunities and where they could go. And I give them examples that are like, you could go to Germany and do a demonstration with a robot, all of these different crazy ideas. And so this process reminds me of something that we've led teams through in the past that just we didn't know the name of. So I think that this is a great description of this model. So I really appreciate it.
I know it's coming up in one of the later slides, but one of the things that just reminded me of, Renee, is when we talk to some of the teams who approach us about the business plan, sometimes they bring up the fact that, well, you were, for a long time, you were the only team in Australia, so you had a big green field. You had no other first teams within 5,000 miles of you, so you guys could do anything. You weren't in a crowded market. And our reply to that is, well, you are in a crowded market, right? You let's say a team in New Hampshire. That's where I'm from, New Hampshire. So you could throw a rock and hit 3 other teams in New Hampshire. But that very same fact becomes a strength. It becomes a weakness. It becomes an opportunity. It becomes a threat that you can build off of as a team. Right? And so there's never a shortage of things that you could pull into your thinking that, give it enough time, enough creativity, enough wild ideas, is going to be the springboard for what's going to make your team unique.
Exactly. Never think that having another team near you or something like that is ever going to be a restraint on you, right? Always think and look at what your strengths and weaknesses are. And think about how can we make our weaknesses and our threats our strengths? How can we use them to our advantage and make things happen with that? And that's really
Yeah. So one of the things we did with one of these teams was we asked them the question. Okay, so you have 200 teams within 50 miles of you. Why haven't you done fill in the blank? So if you have so many first resources, why haven't you done this? And pick something wild and crazy. And the one thing that came up in that conversation is why hasn't every mailbox in your state had something in it about first? And they said, well, that's just really expensive, and there's 6 million people who live in our state. And our reply was, so what? Right? You have 50 teams. Maybe you guys could band together and get a mailer into everybody's mailbox. Now, I doubt that they went off and did that, but the point is that that's your environment that you're operating in. There's a wild and crazy idea on the table that would further first, that would set your team apart. Go for it. Or if that's too hard, then what's slightly easier? What's slightly easier? You know, the sky's the limit. First gives you the framework to do almost anything. And it validates what you're doing, and it gives you a purpose and a presence in the community. And it's just one of those things, like, go for it.
Yeah, exactly. And on that note, when it comes to working with other teams, you always want to think about how, as an individual team, how you can differentiate yourself from others as well, and show that you are an independent team, that you do your own things, but at the same time we work with others because we realize that can be used as a strength to help grow first, to help get the message out about science and technology. So it's always important that you differentiate yourself, but you also work with others, so that you have, kind of two sides to your team that work in unison. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Renee.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to explain, when I go to regional events or even off-season events, I hold roundtable meetings where I ask the teams, certain questions about how their season went, and eventually I lead them into a discussion about what their team challenges are, with the understanding that the veteran teams may have challenges that some of the other veteran teams have accomplished, but the rookie teams in the room will be able to ask them the questions that they've been facing and some of the challenges that they've had, and they can ask questions around those, and the veteran teams can answer them. And so doing this roundtable meeting and kind of having a survey asking teams what their top challenges are is an awesome way to find what your area challenges are and then address and figure out ways to address them, and kind of do this brainstorming process too.
Yeah, the other thing is, I think oftentimes, I know that, as a mentor, sometimes I fall into this trap, and I've talked to other mentors who've been around for a while, and they do as well. And as mature teams, they can fall into the same trap. But oftentimes when younger students or rookie teams come on and they don't know a lot about FIRST, they can't recite Chief Delphi chapter and verse from front to back. You get somebody who comes up with just an outlandish idea, and we dismiss it out of hand. Oh, we can't do that. It will put us over our weight limit if it's a robot design, or we'll never raise enough money, or how are we going to get a mailer into 5 million mailboxes? It's just too expensive. Just the postage alone will kill us. We dismiss things out of hand instead of sitting back and saying, instead of why we can't do it, instead of sitting back and saying, well, how could we do it? Or rather than, what resources would we need, or how would we change that question into something that could be accomplished instead of something that we dismiss out of hand. And oftentimes, again, out of the crazy ideas, something that a younger team might have brought to that round table is something that will rejuvenate an older team, because it starts them thinking about a new question to tackle instead of the same old questions over and over again.
Yeah, like I'm strategy lead on the team, so we look after the business and media side of the team. And whenever new students are coming in, I almost intentionally, when we get new projects, try and avoid the most experienced people at first from saying anything, and I want the new people who have no idea about these constraints and any things like that, and I want them to come out with the ideas, because they're generally the ones that go, I don't know what's possible, the sky may as well be the limit, if anything. And they come out with the brilliant ideas because they don't think about these constraints. They just come out and say, why can't we make a video that has lots of squares and frames flying everywhere and doing all this X, Y, and Z? And those ideas are generally the ones that end up being the most innovative and the most interesting ideas, because they're not aware of those constraints. And I think the one issue with having a lot of experience on a first team and things like that is that people tend to think about constraints more so than the opportunities. And I think it's important that people focus a lot on what they could potentially do and how they can make things even better, even if in their mind they think it isn't possible.
Yeah. Before we get to the next part, the other two things before we close on this section that I wanted to mention was, first of all, this is a process that will help teams who are trying to get better at their business plans, or to do a business plan for the first time, or maybe to do a business plan in a new and different way. This is not the only process to follow, and you should explore other business tools and other processes and adapt, again, what we're talking about to your strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats. There may be something easier for you to do or better for you to do than a SWOT analysis. There may be something that you already have going on in terms of the way that you do collaborative problem solving, but the process itself is something that can be adapted. That's number one. Number two is, through the course of you doing this, your team is going to change as well. And so the way that you do your process is going to be a process in of itself. It'll adapt and it'll change over years, and you'll get better at it, and you'll bring in new tools and new ways of thinking. So the process itself isn't static, just like the business plan itself shouldn't be static. These are all dynamic things, and as you get better at doing them, you're of course going to change the way you do them.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people might not realize the benefit of actually analyzing where your team is currently at. A lot of people might think about where we're going to go in the future and things like that. But analyzing where a team is at, and a life cycle analysis is one of those important things. Identifying where you are in terms of your growth and how you are as a team. Because if you are starting to mature as a business, as a team, and you're starting to plateau, then you want to plan for the future and make sure you don't go back down in the life cycle and start declining as a team. You want to make sure that you can continue through maturity and make sure that you guys are a strong team in the future. And you need to plan that before you guys end up in decline. You want to make sure that you're preventing these things and knowing where you are as a team and not giving yourself that false world of, we're always going to be growing, we're always going to be reaching more people every year. Because it won't happen. Eventually you'll reach all 7 billion people on this earth. And you've got to plateau. And you've got to think about where you guys can go in the future and make sure that you guys don't end up becoming obsolete.
Yeah, go to Mars.
Yeah,
After you get all 7 billion, go to Mars.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You never know, you can find out. There's enough robots out there to keep you busy.
All right, so I guess the next thing for us to look at is, now that you've gone through this process, you want to put together the document. And there's nothing special in the document itself. This is all well-trod ground. You can find lots of resources on the web for doing this thing. But in any document, you want to tell them what you're going to tell them. You want to tell it to them, and then you want to tell them what you told them. And the way that all maps into what we just talked about was, your executive summary is basically for the lazy people who don't want to read the whole document. You need to give that to them so they can quickly get a bird's eye view of it and actually decide whether they want to invest the rest of their valuable time in reading your document. So you should save that to the very end when you've written the whole document.
Yeah, you don't want to end up writing your executive summary right at the beginning before you've written the rest of your business plan. Because one, you might end up realizing things that later on in your business plan that you didn't add in your executive summary. Plus, you're going to get isn't the saying hindsight is 20/20? You look back at what you've done, and therefore you can summarize it the best you can, and always make sure that your executive summary captures the essence of what your business plan is, not your business plan trying to capture the essence of what your executive summary is. So make sure that that bit is actually done at the end.
Yeah, we kind of didn't get to this earlier on, but context is important. We actually had a slide on it, and I think we were too excited about what we're talking about to get to the context bit. But context is important in the sense of, you need to understand where you are, and this forms the basis of your SWOT analysis. Your team history, your community setting, you need to really frame that for the reader of your document so they can understand where you are. Are you an urban team? Are you a suburban team? Do you have trouble getting members because you're a school that's spread out over several hundred square miles? Are you a team of homeschoolers? Or are you a team of inner city kids where you've got access to 3,000 students? All those things, how long you've been around, who are your sponsors, all those things feed into your background and set the context so that people can understand your particular SWOT analysis and the resources that are going to be available to you to solve your problem or answer your questions.
That's definitely right. All right, so make sure that you include a background about your team and explain where you guys are coming from, and that kind of leads into the next section, which is about the question, what your team is asking themselves and how they're going to develop the rest of their business.
And that's really where you go over your SWOT analysis. Yeah. And so up to this point, you've probably not committed about half the size of your document. You want to take about 40%, not quite half, to actually talk about your plan, which is really reviewing your collaborative design process, your convergent or divergent convergent thinking. You want to talk about the few things that you've thought of to solve your question or to approach your question. You want to clearly document who, what, where, when, and how for each one of your solutions, if you will, to your question, each one of the things you're going to do. And then it's really important for you to understand, how do we know when we're done? How do we know when we're successful? How do we know when we're making progress against this? So if you can have metrics or measurements that you're going to do. So like to James' point about peaking as a team, if one of your metrics is team membership or team retention, the number of people who come back year after year, then that's a good measurement that you could use to assess how you're doing on answering that question.
Yeah. Did you have any questions about that, Renee? About the structure of the how it's put together?
No, I did want to mention we do have a business plan and fundraising plan outline for teams to utilize on the first website as part of the fundraising toolkit. And one of the reasons I was so excited to have your team come on board and do this webinar was so that you could talk about how important it is not to just sit down and kind of copy, another business plan from another team and then try to make it your own, but to really go through the process and sit down and consider why each of these areas are important and how the team can do better in the future. And so I think that the fundraising toolkit is a great start for teams, but going through this process, and especially this conversation we've had, I hope the teams really take to heart what they can learn from all of this. So I thank you so much for coming on board.
It's not a problem. It's
Yeah.
a pleasure. We'd like to share exactly what we've done as a team and how to put together your business.
Yeah, it's actually a lot of fun getting to talk about this because it's something we're very passionate about. And we in Australia we've gotten to the point where teams are taking off left and right, so we can see how sharing this sort of information actually plays out and makes it easier for us to operate as a team. So when we get to 10,000 FRC teams around the world, it'll be that much easier for us to operate collectively. So if the more that all teams can do this, the better off we're all going to be. It's going to, all boats will rise as the water goes up.
And I do have one question. How did you build up your team culture to encourage the importance of looking at a team business plan each year and making sure that your team was utilizing these processes and continuing to always improve using the business?
Well, that came back to, the SWOT analysis and looking at what, as a team, we're the first team in Australia, right? So we're going to face a lot of barriers to get over. The whole fact that you're not going to be able to get parts from overseas and ship them into Australia as easily. The fact that everything's going to be more expensive. The fact that we're going to have to travel as a team to go to competitions. There's no competitions in Australia. So it was really important for us to be able to identify those and create a business plan so that we can make sure we have money and that we're sustainable to go into the future. Something that we can present to potential sponsors and say, hey, look, we're a new team, but we've got a plan and we know what we want to do. Have a look over this, and if you want to give us a bit of money so we can go overseas, that is fantastic. So for us, it was imperative to have a business plan. Otherwise, without it, we wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't be able to keep operating. We'd run out of money.
So James is absolutely right, but there's actually a more detailed story behind why we had to put so much effort into our business plan. What James said is absolutely right, but the story behind the story is we realized very early on that in order for our team to be sustainable, we needed other teams nearby. It costs us $40,000 to $50,000 to go to a regional or go to championship, and basically that's enough money to start 8 FRC teams. And so we realized early on that unless we had more FRC teams, unless we had our own regional here at some point in time, it was going to be really, really expensive and not sustainable necessarily to have FRC here for a long time. So in our second year, we got a grant from the state government to start more FRC teams, but we had to find matching money to trigger that grant from sponsors. And we found the sponsors, but we couldn't get any schools to start another team. And it turned out that just waving money and sponsors in front of them wasn't good enough. And the only way that we found out how to solve the problem was to keep improving our business tools to ask the right question, and to do some crazy, wild thinking about how to go solve it. And it took us 2 years to develop or to go through the cycle enough times to get or to hit on a solution. And maybe the process didn't change. We just had to ask the right questions and get the right answer. But basically, the business tools and this process that we shared here today, what it led us to was the thing that we had to solve was how do you get teams, how do you get schools excited about doing FRC when they can't go to a regional? And how do you get schools be able to do FRC when they can't build a robot during build season because it's the summer holiday here? So once we were able to come up with a solution to those two questions, then we finally had an answer to our problem, and then FRC took off here.
Yeah, I think it is worth noting that when we started up the Dual Down Under, which is the off-season event for FRC in Australia, that the moment that it was announced, we said this is happening and that teams can now build during school term as opposed to over the summer holidays, because that's during Christmas and things for us. And once we said that that was an option, I think we had 5 teams sign up overnight.
Yeah,
so from
literally.
one team to 5 overnight is a huge jump. And it just shows that through developing those business tools, we were able to identify an issue and create a solution that has allowed us to get up to 18 teams today in Australia.
Yeah, so these tools really do make a big impact, but you need to stick with them, and you need to sort of develop a culture that continually goes back and asks the question and goes through the problem-solving exercise. And even in our case, well, you might not get it right the first time. So stick with it, and the results will eventually get there.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on board and doing this webinar. If any teams have questions, they can, of course, email me at rbecker@usfirst.org, and I can either get you in touch with the team, or I'm sure you could look on their website, and they may, I'm sure there's contact information there as well for Thunder Down Under. And I just wanted to thank you so much for coming on board and taking some time on your Saturday to talk with us.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Renee.
Thanks, Renee.